But before we go, it's time for my brand new segment. Bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe. Maybe. The title is self-explanatory, so let's dive right on in with our first band, Sonata Arctica. Sonata Arctica is a Finnish metal band that formed in the mid-90s, although it took them until nearly the end of 1999 to nail down their sound and come out with their first album. The band has had a relatively stable lineup over the years, at least since 2000, but the only two permanent members have been Tony Keiko on vocals and keyboards and Tommy Portimo on the drums. Sonata Arctica is best placed in the power metal genre. Now, what is power metal? Well, it's a bit hard to pin down. Mostly it's the uppers to death metal's downers. It's loud, it's exciting, wants to make you feel better about yourself. Power metal sounds like this. That was Kingdom for a Heart, off of Sonata Arctica's first album, Ecliptica. Now, I don't mean to say that power metal can't handle serious topics. The song Replica, off the same album, deals with a soldier coming home who has PTSD, and the longest song on the album, Destruction Preventer, is about nuclear war. And that actually brings me to one of the things I really like about the band. You see, most songs you hear about relationships, you can put on a basic timeline. There's falling in love, getting together, having sex, possibly some cheating on his or her part, and then a messy breakup. The Sonata Arctica, however, has a lot of songs about more unusual relationships. Like on Silence, there's the song San Sebastian, about a guy who gets to date the woman of his dreams, only to realize that she's far too much woman for him to handle, and so he has to leave her and settle for less. When Her Heart's Guild has The Misery, about an author who uses the abusive relationship he's in as an inspiration. Reckoning Night has My Celine, about a man in love with the moon who slowly loses hope for a love he can never obtain. And more recently, on The Days of Grace, there's Juliet, which imagines that Romeo was paralyzed but still alive when Juliet woke up, but he only has enough time to think, "The fuck?" before dying. Over the years, Sonata Arctica has moved away from its power roots and grown darker, more progressive. And I'll talk about progressive metal in a future segment, but for now just think of it as Pink Floyd, but louder and faster. Of course, it can often be hard to track just when and how a band has changed over time, but Sonata Arctica went and made my job easier by remaking one song from each of their first two albums when they re-released them in 2008. So here's Letter to Dana from their first album, and here's that same passage in the remake.
Dana, oh Hara, oh Dana, my dear, how I wish that my Dana was here. Little Dana, oh Hara, decided one day to travel away, far away.
Pretty stark. Personally, I like both versions just fine. But to be perfectly honest, I prefer their older stuff. Still, I own 6 of their 7 studio albums, including the newest 2, all physical copies no less, and I don't regret buying any of them. Heck, I can name a couple of standouts on each one. Replica and Kingdom for a Heart on Ecliptica, San Sebastian Revisited and Wolf and Raven on Silence, The Cage and Victoria's Secret on When Her Heart's Guild, My Celine and White Pearl Black Ocean on Reckoning Night, Paid in Full and It Won't Fade on Unia, Death Aura and Flag in the Ground on the Days of Grace, and Alone in Heaven and Wildfire Part 2 on Stones Grow Her Name. If I had to pick just one album to recommend, I'd go with Reckoning Night. It's right in the middle of their catalog, and it has my 2 favorite songs by them. Thanks for listening, everyone. And remember, metal will never die. It's now time for bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe, maybe. Today's subject is Berzum, and our episode is brought to you by forums user Dimebag's Brain, and unless otherwise stated, the following opinions are not my own. Last time, we looked at a fairly straightforward power metal band, so now it's time to flip the coin and examine the dark side of black metal. Power metal is easy enough to understand, since it's still full of artists who want to show off their skills. With black metal, skill with instrumentation isn't... I'm not doing that for the rest of the review. Skill with instrumentation isn't the point. Instead, black metal prefers to use low-fidelity recordings, simple, repetitive guitar riffs and keyboard work to invoke an atmosphere, and the vocals, well... In metal music, there's a term called clean vocals. Clean vocals refers to what other genres would simply call actually trying to sing. In much of black and death metal, however, the singer sounds like this. And when they aren't screaming, they're growling so low that you can't understand a word that they're saying. Still, if you can get into that, or at least get past that, you'll find that Berzum is a very good black metal project. I say project because it is mainly the work of one man, Varg Vikernes. While black metal originally came out of thrash metal, and for thrash, if you can imagine what someone thrashing on a guitar would sound like, or if you've heard anything Metallica pre-Black Album, you'll have a pretty good idea. Berzum slowly took that and made it more atmospheric, more ambient. This is where it started with their first album, also titled Berzum. That was War, after the word Vikernes shouts most often. Not that you could tell. But as I've mentioned, the lyrics aren't the real point. Not like with other genres. It's what the sound of the screaming adds to the rest of the song. Berzum's second album, Det som Angang var, and please excuse my pronunciations, it's the odd one out, being between the old and the new sound. But the third album, Visli Set Taros, is where he really nailed the atmosphere. That track goes on for 15 minutes, and it's full of hypnotic guitar work, ghostly keyboards, and those inhuman screams. Now there's some debate over whether Berzum hit its peak here or on the fourth album, Philosophem. But after that, Varg Vikernes killed fellow black musician Euryonymus and also got convicted of burning down at least 3 churches. Did I mention that black metal also doubles down on the whole anti-Christian satanic imagery? And so that was the end of that. Vikernes issued more albums, both during and after his imprisonment, but either they were completely ambient music, or else not nearly as groundbreaking as his early work. On the plus side, while Vikernes may be a raging asshole, his music isn't hardly as political as he is, and so it's still worth looking up if you like what you hear. Thanks for listening, everyone, and remember, metal will never die. But before then, time now for another installment of bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe, maybe. Today we'll look at Testament, which is brought to you by forums user Wahad. Testament belongs to the thrash metal genre, an outgrowth of speed metal. Whereas speed metal is basically just heavy metal with the speed of punk rock, thrash draws a few more pages from the punkish book, adding in the raw sounds and the anti-establishment aesthetic, in part as a reaction against the then growing glam metal scene, glam metal being metal mixed with pop music. Thrash is also a lot more American than speed metal, as the latter came out of the new wave of British heavy metal, and the big 4 of thrash are all based in the United States. Today's subject is also American, hailing originally from Berkeley, California. The band formed in the mid-80s, and had a solid lineup for around 9 years and 5 albums, but as you can see, things got a little messy after that. Chuck Billy and Eric Peterson have been consistent members since the band started releasing albums, but just about every other position has seen several different folks in the role, especially on the drums. Now, when you look at Testament's early work, you can pick out pretty much any track and get yourself a perfect example of 80s thrash metal. In fact, let's do that. Here's The New Order, the title track off their second album.
For the past, it's too late. Give the world a chance to control fate. Till the sky, light it clear. Till the world is new on the
As the 90s rolled around, Testament began to move into a more melodic, thoughtful phase that somewhat mirrors how thrash was changing in general. Their last album with the original lineup, The Ritual, is probably their most melodic, something you can definitely hear in the single for that album, Return to Serenity. However, as Testament's lineup began to shift, so did their tone. Whereas Metallica wandered away from thrash and towards a more mainstream heavy metal during the 90s, Testament took a left turn into the extreme genres. The move was gradual, but by 1999's The Gathering, Testament had become pretty much straight-up death metal. Here's Eyes of Wrath off of that album.
the broken flesh, anoints the silver light.
sound changes came after the new millennium. Guitarist James Murphy got a brain tumor, Chuck Billy got cancer, Eric Peterson broke his leg, and the whole band went on hiatus for about 2 years. Things finally worked themselves out by the late aughts, and 2 of the original members even found their way back into the band. Appropriately enough, their sound shifted back into more classic thrash as well. You can tell from their latest albums that they've picked up a few things from their dip into death metal, but have a listen to Throne of Thorns off their 2012 album, Dark Roots of the Earth.
Crimson lust, warlords of torment that do attack me, power mad, opposing armies are beat on your death, the fatally wounded, forever forgotten, history's written in blood, the pillaging forces blinded by hate, my kingdom is out of control, God of war, fireborn, throne of thorns.
Now that's some thrash metal, if ever I've heard any. With their lineup more or less stable once again, Testament has promised more touring and more regular album releases, so if you like what you've heard, now is a good time to become a fan. Thanks for listening, everyone, and remember, no matter how hard cancer may try, metal will never die. Let's have another look at bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe, maybe. You know what metal needs? More women. Whether you consider it a good thing or not, heavy metal has a reputation for hyper-masculinity, and there are a number of bands who revel in that reputation. I'm looking at you, Manowar. Still, even for a genre known for its volume and aggression, there's room for a more feminine touch. For example, our subject for today, Nightwish. Nightwish is known as a symphonic metal band. Now, symphonic metal is actually pretty hard to pin down. Despite what you might imagine, symphonic elements work well in all kinds of metal, thanks to the genre's focus on longer songs, virtuoso instrumentalists, and topics considered over the top in rock and roll, but which fit right in with classical music. As such, symphonic metal is more an adjective than a proper genre. But when people talk about symphonic metal on its own, they usually mean symphonic power metal with a female lead singer. Nightwish is another Finnish band, and it's had a remarkably solid lineup aside from the lead singer, and we'll get to that. But as such, Nightwish has had a pretty consistent sound throughout their timeline. Soaring, theatrical, operatic. The composer, Tuomas Holopainen, has admitted that he's inspired foremost by film soundtracks. Here's a classic from an early album, Sleeping Sun. Of course, Tarja Turunen's soaring vocals really help with that operatic feel. Anyway, while the sound may not have changed much, as Nightwish grew in popularity, they were able to add in a few different things, like working with a real orchestra, as of their 5th album, Once. Here's an excerpt you actually might have heard without realizing what it was. Ghost Love Score. Unfortunately, after the Once World Tour, Nightwish fired Turunen. Apparently, she and her husband thought of the band one way while the rest of the band considered things differently, but they were kinda dickish for how they did it. They made an announcement in an open letter, and that was how Tarja found out she was fired. So after that, there was a lengthy audition to find a new lead vocalist, and after about a year, Annette Olsen was chosen. Olsen is really the biggest single change to Nightwish's style, since she's a much more traditional singer, compared to Turunen's operatic style. Here's The Poet and the Pendulum, off of Olsen's first Nightwish album, Dark Passion Play. Personally, I like both singers. Olsen isn't Turunen, and she isn't trying to be. Although most Nightwish fans will fight to the death over which singer's better. Oddly enough, both camps now have something in common, since Olsen was also fired from Nightwish after their 7th album, Imagineerum, which, by the way, is also a movie. The band cited creative differences again, but the fact that Olsen was pregnant with her 3rd kid and the band was on tour at the time may have been a factor. As for right now, Floor Jansen from After Forever and Revamp is subbing in as singer until the tour ends, and after that it seems like the band will go back on hiatus, at least until they find a new lead singer. But regardless of whether they keep going or not, remember, metal will never die. But as for right now, it's time once again for bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe maybe. Today's episode on Bolt Thrower is brought to you by forums user Evil Urchin. And as always, the following opinions are not my own aside from this one. I'm really not fond of death metal. Right, first a word on the genre. Death metal originally grew out of punk, speed, and black metal. But over the years it's become its own odd sort of beast. Death metal tends to use fast, complicated, and yet highly repetitive riffs, along with low-fidelity recording, down-tuned everythings, and instead of the screaming of black metal, you'll find a whole lot of growling instead. Here's an example. Ritual, off of Bolt Thrower's 4th album, The Fourth Crusade. Bolt Thrower is originally from Coventry, England, and they take their name from a weapon in Warhammer 40k. If you aren't familiar with that wargame setting, look it up. You'll find plenty of material out on the internet. You don't need to know too much, though, since aside from some cover art and preoccupation with war, Bolt Thrower and Warhammer don't really overlap. Back when they started in the mid-80s, Bolt Thrower was more between hardcore punk and death metal than just one or the other. Something you can hear in the raw, wild speed of their earliest works, such as World Eater off their 2nd album, Realm of Chaos. However, as they moved into the 90s and started burning their way through drummers and vocalists, Bolt Thrower moved more into death metal, with a few elements borrowed from doom metal. And for doom metal, just imagine if early Black Sabbath were its own genre. This involved down-tuning their instruments even further, and focusing more on the atmosphere of the riffing than on the speed. From time to time, over the course of their 8 studio albums, Bolt Thrower has experimented on an exact balance between punk and doom elements, but on their last album, Those Once Loyal, released in 2005, they have achieved what they themselves call the perfect Bolt Thrower album, and as such they have since then stopped producing studio albums. So while the band is still around, it would seem their discography is now complete. Let's end things with an excerpt from this perfect album, Entrenched. And remember, perfect albums may come and go, but metal will live forever. And as for this time, I've got another band you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe, maybe. Today I'll cover Symphony X. Symphony X is a New Jersey band that formed in 1994. They play progressive metal, which is another one of those hard-to-define genres. Not because it's a broad category, however, but because progressive music in general is dedicated to stretching and blending genres and styles themselves. Symphony X, for instance, lifts a lot straight from classical works, something you might guess from the name, making them also a neo-classical metal band. But others might layer in techno beats or experiment with ambient music. No two progressive acts are really the same. Symphony X has had a damn solid lineup over the years, particularly since the new millennium started. Overall, their sound hasn't changed too much over the years either, although I would say they get more refined as you go forward. And they've certainly tried new things on all their various albums. Like on the third album, The Divine Wings of Tragedy, whose title track is over 20 minutes long. It begins with an a cappella chorus that lasts a full minute, and then an instrumental that goes on for 4 minutes more. Here, have an entirely insufficient sample. Now, if that's just not enough for you, don't worry. Their 6th album, The Odyssey, features a 24-minute song about the Homeric epic. The whole thing. And unlike sissy short songs like Inagata Devia, where freeform solos take up most of the time, this thing was composed from start to finish. Here's a sample from near the end that'll rock your ass off. Quick spoilers. Odysseus kills his wife's suitors.
Vengeance, it swells within me as I spy so many who are my queen. I'll make them pay for this blasphemy. Oh, we'll see. Triumphant champion of Ithaca. I will right all the wrongs. Let the gods sing my song. Oh, triumphant champion of Ithaca. Let a new life begin. My journey has come to an end. Whoa.
More recently, Symphony X has begun producing concept albums, where the whole thing tells an overarching story, or relies on a similar theme. The first such was their 5th album, V, the New Mythology Suite, which is about the rise and fall of Atlantis and how their survivors caused the rise and fall of Egypt in turn. Skipping the Odyssey, their 7th album, Paradise Lost, is about, well, yeah, and their 8th and most recent album, Iconoclast, is about a world where the machines have taken over. One last thing I wanted to mention is that Symphony X also happens to screw around with meter timings more than any other band I have ever come across. Here, listen to this quick selection from Egypt off of V and try and count how often the timing shifts. Alright, I'll give you a moment to count up. Now, if your answer was anything other than 9, then you're wrong. The first part was 2 alternating pairs of 7/8 and 8/8. Then the middle part was 2 bars of 6/8, 1 bar of 4/4, 2 more of 6/8, 2 more of 4/4, and then the last section slid into even 3/4. And even I can't keep track half the time. I know they've gone up to at least 12/8 on some occasions. Anyway, if any of you are intrigued, I'd recommend starting with V, the New Mythology Suite. It was my first Symphony X album, and it's still my favorite. And just like Odysseus in the end, metal will never die. But now, it's time again for bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe, maybe. Today's episode covers Alchemist, and it's brought to you by forums user Rajo Rapper. Last time I touched on progressive metal, which is about blurring the lines between genres. Blurring the lines between metal and other genres, in this case. However, there is something beyond that. Experimental or avant-garde metal, which blurs the line between metal and noise. With progressive metal, there's at least enough consistency that you can pin it down as being progressive. Avant-garde metal takes that, mixes in some death and or black metal, some random instruments, and then whatever the hell else it wants. In today's case, we've got prog, we've got death, we've got psychedelics, we've even got some Australian Aboriginal themes. Alchemist was formed in Australia in 1987 by Adam Agius, who was its only consistent member throughout the band's run, although the drummer Rodney Holder came in soon after, and the lineup settled after 1992. It originally started out as plain old death metal, but that didn't last very long. Their first real album, Jar of Kingdom, was released in '93, and it was already too psychedelic to be straight death. Agius also couldn't make up his mind about either screaming or growling. Here's him doing both in Garden of Eroticism off their second album, Lunasphere. As time passed, Alchemist lived up to its name and started mixing in even more influences. Eastern, Indian, Aboriginal, electronic. Lyrically, they tend to focus on themes about space and spiritualism. In '98, they put out an EP about space travel, including a cover of Jeff Wayne's Eve of the War off the latter's prog rock concept album about War of the Worlds. If you haven't heard it, look it up. It may not be metal, but it still kicks ass. But here's the cover. Something else about Alchemist is they ran their own music festival, Metal for the Mind, for 10 years, between 96 and 06. Unfortunately, after getting together in 2010 to try and record a 7th full-length album, Alchemist instead went on hiatus indefinitely. Still, Adam Aegeus isn't taking the time to rest. Instead, he's formed the Levitation Hex, released a new album, and is going on tour. Let me leave you with the lead song from Alchemist's 5th album, Australalian. And remember, the context may be first contact with aliens, but the subtext is colonization. And remember, though it may form itself into unrecognizable shapes at times, metal will never die. So instead, let's look at another band you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe, maybe. Today, let's look at Lumsk, presented by forums user Cosmonaut. Lumsk is a Norwegian folk metal band, or were, at least. I'll get to that. Folk metal is another genre that's more broadly descriptive than it is indicative. Like symphonic elements, folk melodies can be incorporated into a wide variety of styles, whether it's the pop folk from the 1960s, folk rock, or anywhere in the spectrum of metal. Still, you'll see more acoustic instruments played in folk metal bands than in the regular kind, and the subject matter tends to be quite old indeed. Lumsk formed in 1999, though their first album didn't come out until 2003. By then the core of the band had settled on Espen Warankov Godu on keyboards, Eystein Garberg on guitar, and Espen Hammer on bass. Lumsk uses both male and female vocals at times, but the female vocals tend to be used more often. To date, Lumsk has only released 3 albums, so let's go through each one. Their first album, Asmund Fegdigjaver, is a concept album that tells a story about Asmund, an actual Nordic hero who, in the album story, sails from Ireland to rescue a princess from an evil band of trolls. This excerpt is from the 4th track, I Trollahender. Please excuse the lyrics if they're a bit off. I got these off the internet and, well, I can't exactly verify them myself. Lumsk's second album, Troll, added in a few more band members and a violin to add to that folk flavor. Although the subject of the album is still Norwegian mythology, the tracks are not connected like the first albums are. Trolltind, or Troll Peak, for example, is about a bunch of giant trolls who got drunk at a wedding, lost track of time, got caught by the sun's light, and turned into a series of mountains. Here's the sample.
Ved foten av fjellet Romsdals horn, alle jotnene skulle feira.
With their last album, however, Lumsk has strayed entirely away from metal and into a progressive rock take on folk music. Which isn't to say they aren't still worth listening to, though. Their third and most recent album sets a number of Norwegian poet Knut Hamsun's poems to music, and you should hear what they're doing with them. This next bit is from 100 år allting glemt, or in 100 years, everything will be forgotten.
Men vi skal jeg være så langt beklemt. Om 100 år allting glemt.
Still, though bands may come and go from the genre, metal will never die. You know what? Enough of this new shit. It's time we take a look at a band you probably haven't heard of unless you lived through the 70s. Maybe. The band we'll be discussing is Manila Road. Brought to you once again by forums user Dimebag's Brain. Manila Road is the child of Mark Shelton. They formed originally in Wichita, Kansas, way back in 1977. While they may not have been among the first heavy metal bands, they were still far more a part of that original wave than any of the subgenres that have sprung up since. That said, the band's roots are based more in prog and space rock being prog on Quaaludes, which is something you can hear on their first album, Invasion, and Mark of the Beast, which would have been released as their second album had they not scrapped it to go into heavy metal. Mark of the Beast was eventually released in 2002, so here's an excerpt from Avatar, so you know where they're starting from. Manila Road's second actual album goes by a name every heavy metal band ever since only wishes they could have picked. Metal. Unfortunately, the band's discography is 16 studio albums deep, and that's despite spending the 90s on hiatus, so I'm only gonna zip through the band's history here. The band's single biggest album is Crystal Logic, released in 1983, the next one after Metal. Here's a bit from their great big finisher, Dreams of Eschaton.
Before the gods of hell sentence you to die, remember well, my friend, the warlord never cries. These are the words that I've heard inside my mind. When Ragnarok comes down the hall, run out of time.
After Crystal Logic, Manila Road got a new, faster drummer, which got the band doing faster, thrashier songs throughout the 80s. A grand total of 5 studio albums and 1 live album were released between 1985 and 1990, but once The Courts of Chaos was released, the band split up. In 1992, Mark Shelton released the Circus Maximus as a solo project, and the only reason it's got the Manila Road name on it is because the studio wanted to sell more copies, and so we'll just be skipping that. In 2001, Mark Shelton reformed Manila Road and put out 6 new albums. 7 if you count Mark of the Beast from earlier. From their new albums, you can see that Manila Road has changed, both a lot and not much at all since the old days. The thrash metal is toned down from where they left off, but then you can find death metal influences, power metal, maybe a little doom, a little black, some prog from the early days. In other words, Manila Road is, quite simply, heavy metal. Here's Tree of Life from the excellent 2008 album Voyager. And remember, no matter who may last and who may fall, heavy metal will never die. Right, so, this week on bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe, maybe. Let's take a look at a gothic metal band. Today's episode about Virgin Black is yet again brought to you by Dimebag's Brain. Gothic metal is a lot like symphonic and folk metal in that it's not a proper genre so much as a stylistic descriptor. To be gothic is very much about the style rather than the substance. It's all in the lyrics, the clothing, the stage presence. Most people who consider gothic metal think of a particular blend of symphonic and death metal. A sort of Beauty and the Beast dual vocals, but really a band from any metal genre can be gothic. Virgin Black happens to be doom metal, with just a sprinkle of death. So it's about time I describe the former as well. Doom metal takes a lot of inspiration from early Black Sabbath during the Ozzy Osbourne era. The tempo is slow and plodding, like a funeral march. The keys are minor. The subject matter is as depressing or sinister as what you'd expect from something labeled doom. Death doom is a popular, or was a popular fusion genre, marked mostly by replacing the normally clean doom vocals with death growls. Still, Virgin Black is mostly doom, along with some symphonic elements that can add a sort of black metal atmosphere at times. The band is another Australian group. They formed in 1995, and the core members are Rowan London on vocals and keyboard and Samantha Escarb on guitar. 11 others have been members for various lengths of time, but London and Escarb are the only 2 founders. After a demo and an EP, Virgin Black released their first full-length album, Somber Romantic, in 2001. You can get a good sense of their particular mix of genres off this album, so let's have a listen to Walk Without Limbs.
Walk without limbs. Walk through my soul. Walk without limbs. Walk through my soul. Walk without limbs. Walk through my soul.
If the lyrics struck you as melodramatic, don't worry, that was intentional. A defining element of Gothic music is its melodramatic take on death, love, and spirituality. In 2003, Virgin Black put out its second album, Elegant and Dying, which is, to be honest, not very metal at all. Not that that's a bad thing, but it bears mentioning. Instead, it focuses more on the symphonic atmosphere, and that, plus a little screaming, is where the black metal elements really kick in. Here's a sample from Our Wings Are Burning.
On the crest of fire, our wings are burning. Oh, glorious the on the ways of God, take on its
After their second album, Virgin Black planned to put together a trilogy called The Requiem. Part 1 would be called Pianissimo and consist entirely of classical music, including the use of a live orchestra. Part 2, Mezzo Forte, would be an even mix of symphonic and metal elements, and the third album, Fortissimo, would be metal through and through. Unfortunately, Rowan London's father died during the recording period, and after that the release schedule got a little mixed up. Mezzo Forte was released in '07, and Fortissimo in '08, but Pianissimo has yet to be released at all. The band is currently on hiatus, but they've promised that if and when they do get back to work, Pianissimo will be sure to follow. Let's finish out today with a good example of doom from Virgin Black's Medium album, Mezzo Forte's Domine. And despite how obsessed over death and damnation some of its practitioners can get, metal will never die. This week on bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe maybe, strap in. It's going to be a long one. So how many of you out there like rock operas? Did you listen to Tommy all the time? Did you go see Rock of Ages on Broadway? Do you think the one thing that Jesus Christ Superstar really could have used is a down-tuned guitar shredding away in the background? Well, have I got some good news for you. Arion is a progressive metal project created by Arion Lucassen. However, unlike Varg Vikernes and Berzum, who did everything himself, Lucassen composes the song and plays most of the guitar and keyboard work, but he also gets other musicians in to play drums, acoustic instruments, and guest solos. And of course, seeing as it's opera, lots and lots of vocalists. Partly because Arion doesn't tour, Lucassen has gotten some pretty incredible talent to show up on his albums. Here are just a few highlights. Robert Westerholt and Sharon Den Adel from Within Temptation, Andy Daris from Helloween, Russell Allen from Symphony X, Fabio Leone from Rhapsody of Fire, Hansi Kursk from Blind Guardian, Fleur Janssen from, officially now, Nightwish, James Labrie from Dream Theater, Devin Townsend from whatever it is that he does, and my personal favorite vocalist, who can never seem to land a steady gig, Jorn Lande. I could keep going, but we have lots of other stuff to cover. There's actually a lot of plot in every Arion release, as you might expect, so I'm just giving you the short versions here. The first Arion album is, oddly, The Final Experiment, and it begins the anti-technology/apocalyptic themes that continue throughout the metaplot which most of the releases fit into. A man named Arion, who lives in King Arthur's court as a minstrel, sees visions of an apocalypse sent back from a future time, but he is ultimately silenced by Merlin, who doesn't believe in his prophecies until it's too late to save him. The second album, Actual Fantasy, isn't a proper opera or involved in the metaplot, but simply tells a few fantasy and sci-fi stories of its own. The third album, Into the Electric Castle, begins the tradition of 2-disc albums and also marks the first time when individual vocalists play specific roles throughout the album. A group of people from throughout history are brought to a castle beyond time and space, where they're forced through a gauntlet of dangers based around emotions by aliens called the Forevers, who have lost their connection to their own passions. After that is the Universal Migrator, Parts 1 and 2, which is about the last human alive. In 2084, the nuclear holocaust occurs, leaving only a few colonists on Mars in a dome which cannot sustain itself alone. Eventually, the last survivor climbs into the dream sequencer to relive his life, and then continues back into the cosmic past, where he discovers the Universal Migrator, the very first living soul from which all others descend. By connecting to it, he becomes the next migrator, able to spread humanity's legacy to the rest of the cosmos. Next is the human equation, which is only slightly attached to the others by a couple of lines spoken at the end. The human equation is about a man trapped in a coma with the personifications of his emotions. As time goes on, he has to remember his past and the reason he's in a coma so he can decide whether to wake up or pass away. And hey, how about a song finally? Here's a bit from Day 11, Love.
Friday night,
There was no
I had a feeling.
need to talk.
There she was,
We just started to walk.
hand in hand,
And we
we took the
danced,
floor.
and we danced,
we could
and we
talk
danced.
even more.
Doing great tonight, we ain't got all night. Do now, I think it's alright. Don't mess about, let her in, let the party begin. Remember your far away.
In 2008, Lucasen released the culmination of the Arion metaplot, 01011001, which is Y in binary. It connects all the previous albums, except for Actual Fantasy, into a single narrative where the Forevers from Planet Y created humanity as an experiment, and it explains that despite humanity's dark end, the Universal Migrator managed to reignite the passions of the Forevers, validating our existence. Here's a sample from The Sixth Extinction, the climax of the album, and perhaps the entire project, and the song that hooked me on Arion. After a long break, Lucasen has put out a new album as of the end of October, The Theory of Everything. It's really more of a return to the human equation. Despite the name, the story is small scale, and it's really more about the meaning of life than the theory of everything. As for what it's like, well, go buy it and find out. But if you insist, here's a bit from The Lighthouse.
I need to show my father, I need to show them all. I am the one.
The time has come
to unlock the equation.
The theory of everything.
Before I go, special mention has to go to a couple of Lucasen's side projects. The first is Ambion, which released a few ambient versions of Arion songs. And the second is Guilt Machine, which released a very particular, very dark album about guilt and regret. Beyond that, go find out for yourself. And remember, even if humanity itself should fall, The metal will never die. And on that note, this week on bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe maybe, do you know what metal needs? More non-Europeans. Now, it's an established stereotype that metal equals big ol' white dudes. And to an extent, that's true. It's understandable, too. Music is a lot like poetry. We prefer the stuff that sounds like ourselves, even when no one's singing an actual lyrical poem to it. And so it has a hard time crossing language and cultural barriers. Heavy metal has a very Germanic sound, and so it's no surprise that it's most popular in nations that speak a Germanic language. However, music has a way of crossing cultural boundaries that the wordplay of poetry alone simply can't. As such, heavy metal, like many genres from across the world, has fans in every nation. Though perhaps no metal stronghold is quite so inexplicable as Japan. Yeah, that Japan. So for today, let's look at a band you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Asia, maybe. This episode about Galnarias is brought to you by forums user Scurvy Kip. Galnarias is a power metal band based in Osaka, Japan. Originally, it was only a guitarist and a vocalist who went by the names Shu and Yama B, respectively, but by the time they released their first full-length album, they had added a full-time bassist, keyboardist, and drummer. Now, despite being a band for just over a decade, Galnarias has already released 8 studio albums, along with 4 EPs and 5 cover albums, so let's take these in groups. From 2003 through 2007, you have their first 4 albums: The Flag of Punishment, Advance to the Fall, Beyond the End of Despair, and One for All for One. By the way, those first 3 also have the distinction of having their cover art drawn by Yoshitaka Amano, whose artwork some of you might remember better from a certain Final Fantasy or two. Anyway, regarding the music itself, this first period is where Galnarias was basically feeling itself out and getting its feet. For an example, here's Everlasting, a pretty classic example of Japanese power metal. After this came a somewhat dark turn in the band's 5th album, Reincarnation. Now, dark for power metal is still something entirely different than actual black or death metal, but let's listen to just what that means in Blast of Hell. After Reincarnation, Yama B left the band, citing creative differences. Apparently he prefers to plan things out, but Shu has a more free-form approach. Getting a new vocalist, whose nickname is Sho, would keep them from releasing in 2009, but after that, they got right back to dropping a new album every year. Resurrection in 2010, Phoenix Rising in 2011, and Angel of Salvation in 2012. This year they released a 2-disc cover album of their own early Yama B period instead, but something tells me we won't have to wait long for new material to come out. So let's hear some of this new stuff. Still Loving You, off of Resurrection. And remember, even if dead white European men happen to go out of style, you can be sure that metal will never die. Well, today on bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe maybe, let's head back to the United States. This episode on Nevermore is brought to you by forums user Inscrutable Horse. Nevermore is a band that formed in Seattle in 1991. Now, if you're at all familiar with what was going on in Seattle in the early 90s, you might think that that's an odd time and place to be forming a metal band. Well, it is related. Back when Nirvana was hitting the big time, a power metal band named Sanctuary was pressured by its label, Epic Records, to change its sound to grunge. Instead of doing that, though, they disbanded. And singer Werrell Dane, bassist Jim Shepard, and guitarist Jeff Loomis, along with drummer Van Williams, whom they picked up in '95, formed a new band without an obligation to Epic, named Nevermore. Nevermore is a progressive metal band, but only in that they defy too many genres to be anything else. Whereas Symphony X is power metal, neoclassical, and Arion is techno-industrial experimental rock opera metal, Nevermore is more of a symphonic thrash black death doom. You know what, just here. From their self-titled debut album, The Saintly Assassin.
I am ever strong against the all-knowing thief of imagination. And the sanity assassin is coming down to steal your mind. So he takes an innocent vision. The blind lead the blind, they say. Meet the sanity assassin.
Nevermore's sound has had an interesting development, because while their core has always been the same 4 guys, they've had a second guitarist come in now and again, plus a band this in between genres will always tend to wander around. There was also this time in the late 90s where Werrell Dane's girlfriend joined a cult and disappeared forever, which wound up inspiring the band's 3rd album, Dreaming Neon Black. Here's No More Will from that album.
Free me from this fear of confusion. These tears of dust are the tears from one who knows why. Try your own eyes. I can't sympathize.
Nevermore never really committed to a heavier or a lighter sound like most other bands. So while Dreaming Neon Black was fairly light, most albums were a mix between the light and heavy sounds. The best example from the other end of their spectrum, however, would likely be This Godless Endeavor, released in 2005. The album is full of dark, angry songs, best played when you're driving at multiples of the speed limit. Here's a bit from the first track, Born, the Retribution of Spiritual Sickness.
I
Nevermore would wind up releasing one more album, The Obsidian Conspiracy, before Jeff Loomis and Van Williams left in 2011. The band is on an indefinite hiatus, but in more positive news, Werrell Dane and Jim Shepard have gotten most of the old Sanctuary crew back together for a reunion tour and a new album which may be coming out soon. And remember, no matter what the bands or the genres may be called, metal will never die. Anyway, this time on bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe maybe, let's take a look at Avantasia. For real, this time. Let me start with a question. You remember Arion? Did you maybe like the idea of a metal opera but thought Arion Lucassen was too proggy for you? Well, have I got good news for you. Avantasia is another metal opera project, this one helmed by German artist Tobias Sammet, also known for being the vocalist of the band Ed Guy. In 1999, Sammet got the idea of doing a metal opera while on tour with Ed Guy. When that tour finished, he gathered a number of musicians and vocalists and put out exactly that, The Metal Opera Part 1, in 2001. While none of Avantasia's albums have been double-length like Arion's, the stories don't fit on one CD either, and so the metal opera was completed with Part 2 in 2002. Let's start out with a quick sample from The Seven Angels, the first track of the second album. Much like Arion, Avantasia also features a number of guest singers, but also more guest musicians, as Sammet composes all the music but generally only plays keyboards and bass guitar. Some notable guests include Tim Owens from Judas Priest, Michael Kiske and Kai Hansen, both former Helloween singers, Timo Tolkki from Stratovarius, Klaus Meine from the Scorpions, Russell Allen from Symphony X, again, and my personal favorite singer who had nothing better to do in 2008, Bjorn Land. Oh, and Alice fucking Cooper! The plot of the metal opera is pretty involved, but the quick version is that Gabriel Lehman, voiced by Sammet himself, needs to rescue his sister from the Catholic Inquisition in 1602. In the process, he stumbles into another world full of dwarves and elves, the titular Avantasia, as well as Pope Clement VIII's plans to steal an artifact and doom the other world. Lots of people die as the plot moves on, but in the end, Gabriel is reunited with his sister, and they both escape into the unknown future. By contrast, the plot of the second opera and third album, The Scarecrow, is much less specific. In essence, the Scarecrow, once again voiced by Sammet himself, sells his soul to Jornland for money and fame to get the attentions of a woman who doesn't even know he exists, mostly because he could never reach out to her. Ultimately, he fails, and the two albums after that, The Wicked Symphony and Angel of Babylon, describe the Scarecrow's attempts to assuage the pain with drugs and prostitutes, eventually falling to nothing. Here's a bit from the title track of the first album.
You burn your faith on unholy ground. You roam the barren, wicked plains abound. In evil eyes, evil speak. About it all, you evil freaks. When you say it's all divine and meant to be, yeah. Whoa, what about your flesh and blood and defiance like me?
After a long break and 2 live tours, you heard me, Sammet released The Mystery of Time earlier this year and began another tour. This new album starts another plotline, this one about Aaron Blackwell, a scientist in 19th century Britain who is given a strange clock which shows him visions of other times and dimensions, and then brought into a machine-worshipping cult. Word is that 2004's Waken Festival will be the last appearance of Avantasia for some time to come, but the final sentence in the Mystery of Time's booklet is End of Chapter 1, so I don't think we've seen the end of the project just yet. Here's a bit from Spectres, the big opener for the album.
Make haste as the wind's getting colder, chasing the dreamer away. Wide open minds will divine without treason. Cold as the night as you're braving the gale. Wide open eyes, a spectre is blazing through a moonlit sky.
By the way, if you were wondering if Lucasen and Sammet know about each other, the answer is yeah. Heck, they released 01011001 and The Scarecrow on the very same day in 2008. And so when the media brought this fact up, they raised this big public stink about hating each other's guts. Supposedly Lucasen hated Sammet for getting Alice Cooper, while Sammet hated Lucasen for getting Bruce Dickinson. They then cashed in on this publicity with the EP Elected, which features a cover of Alice Cooper's Elected performed by both artists. And remember, so long as we've got crazy assholes like these running around, metal will never die. Now, on today's very last bands you probably haven't heard of unless you live in Europe maybe, I'm going to spotlight one genre I've kept in reserve since it's the Tainted Coil's preference: industrial metal. This episode on Ministry is brought to you by Evil Urchin. Now, industrial is actually a subgenre of electronica or techno. It's all composed on a keyboard and computer, but while techno doesn't try to sound like real instruments, industrial music apes the sort of sounds you'd expect to hear in a factory. As such, it's the heaviest form of electronica, and therefore blends quite easily with the guitars and drums of metal, thrash metal in particular. Ministry was formed in 1981 in Chicago, Illinois, by the band's sole consistent member, Al Jorgensen. Now, at first the band played synth pop, really just exactly what you'd expect when you hear the word synthy 80s pop music, but Jorgensen didn't like that at all. And so by the third album, released in '88, The Land of Rape and Honey, well, you can already tell, he gathered some real guitars, along with the second longest lasting band member, bassist Paul Barker, and drank deep from the well of underground thrash metal. The band didn't stay underground, however. In 1992, with Psalm 69, The Way to Succeed and the Way to Suck Eggs, Ministry hit the mainstream. Here's Jesus Built My Hot Rod off of that album.
I wanna love you.
rest of the 90s weren't so nice to the band, unfortunately. Problems included drugs, various arrests, and 2 experimental albums that didn't do so well. The first more metal, and the second more melodic, although the latter got its single Bad Blood into the film The Matrix. Finally, in the early aughts, Jorgensen's heroin addiction led him to losing a toe, to an infected hypodermic needle wound, and almost losing his arm to a spider bite, causing him to finally clean up. What he did instead, however, was get political, like really political. The guy hated George W. Bush, and the next 3 albums after his recovery album were all basically dedicated against him. For an example, here's No W off of The Houses of the Mole. The Last Sucker was intended to be the last Ministry album, as Jorgensen had by this point started his own label, which required a lot of his time, but in 2011, band reunited, insofar as a band with this many members could reunite, and after a live show at Waken, they put out a new album, Relapse. Unfortunately, the 3rd longest standing Ministry member, Mike Scaccia, died in 2012, and so Jorgensen has promised that From Beer to Eternity, released in September of this year, will be the real last album Ministry ever puts out. And that's all I got. Now it's up to all of you. Go out and make the world a more metal place. After all, so long as folks like you are listening, metal will never die.